I'm Ed Nersessian, and this is the first of a series of 5 roundtables on the census that was suggested and organized by Jerry Horowitz, who is the Associate Director of the Center. I will just tell you about the next program, and Jerry will then take over. So the next one is on touch, and on taste, and people who will be... I will. Come sit closer. I can't speak any louder without yelling. I think he increased the, is it better now? Loud, yeah. So the people who will be participating in that roundtable who we have so far are Paul Breslin, who is a geneticist and biologist from Rutgers. We have Gerald Levinson, who's professor of philosophy from the University of Maryland. We have John McCabe, who's a journalist, science writer, and who's written on food science. And then we have Nils Noren, who's an internationally known chef and educator. So that's it from me. Jerry will take over.
Thank you, Ed. I'm eager to hear this conversation we're about to start out, and I want to introduce the participants, of course. So first, Tapamayuk Bhattacharjee is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at Cornell University, where he directs the M-Prize Lab. He completed his PhD in robotics from the Georgia Institute of Technology and was an NIH Ruth L. Kirstein NRSA postdoctoral research associate in computer science and engineering at the University of Washington. He wants to enable robots to assist people with mobility limitations and activities of daily living. His work spans the fields of human-robot interaction, haptic perception, which of course is relevant here, and robot manipulation, and focuses on addressing the fundamental research questions on how to leverage robot world physical interactions in unstructured human environments to perform relevant activities of daily living. Andrea Gadbury is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at New York University. Her first book, Cartesian Poetics, The Art of Thinking, from the University of Chicago Press, appeared in 2020. She is currently at work on 2 new book projects, one on early modern rationalism and literary causality, and a second tentatively entitled Notes on Clapping. Wonderful. Pascal Massy was educated in France at the École Normale Supérieure Agrégation and completed his PhD at Vanderbilt University. He is currently associate professor at Miami University in Ohio. His work focuses on ancient and medieval philosophy as well as contemporary continental philosophy. He is the author of Contingency, Time, and Possibility, an essay on Aristotle and Duns Scotus, Lexington Press. He proposes a revision of the prevailing interpretation of the history of modal logic, according to which Scotus rejected the principle of plenitude attributed to Aristotle and replaced the ancient diachronic theory of possibilities with a synchronic one, thereby contributing to a, quote, possible world semantics. Yalda Moretti is an assistant professor at the Pain Research Center in the Department of Molecular Pathobiology at New York University College of Dentistry. Her research focuses on the biology of somatosensory neurons that innervate the oral cavity and upper airways, investigating how information from these neurons guides oral functions such as flavor perception, feeding mechanics, airway protection, and vocalization. Dr. Moyetti earned her BS from the University of Texas at Austin and her PhD in neuroscience from Baylor College. And last but not least, Sushma Subramanian is the author of, quote, How to Feel, the Science of and Meaning of Touch, unquote, a book that explores the scientific, physical, emotional, and cultural aspects of touch, and that aims to reconnect readers to what is arguably our most important sense. Her other journalistic writings, which focus on scientific research inquiries that affect our day-to-day experience of life, have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Scientific American, Discover, Elle, and many others. She also teaches journalism as an associate professor at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. And with that, I think we'll get started. Can everyone hear me? Oh, let me see. There we go. Okay. Am I audible to everybody? No. Is it okay? Okay, oh, there we go. Okay. So look, when we decided, all of us together, I did spearhead this series to some degree, but we collectively at Helix thought it would be such a fascinating series to have people come and talk about the senses in general. And first of all, it's so interesting to think that why do we have the particular order we have? We go from touch to taste to smell to hearing and vision. And of course, that's an interesting topic, why that sequence. But there's such an important opportunity here because we so much value multidisciplinary interactions to talk about a subject that's so fundamental. I mean, what is more fundamental than our sense of touch? And yet it's very deep. And there's so much more to it than I think, I hate to say it, meets the eye. So if anyone wants to start off and give their own thought about why touch is mysterious and so interesting, please do.
Okay, I can start by commenting on what you just said about the hierarchy that you have proposed. In the story of Western thought, there is a fundamental tendency to address things in terms of hierarchies. So intellection is superior to sensation. But within sensation, the sense of touch is the lowest one, whereas sight is the highest one. As you know, one way of saying I understand in many languages is I see. Video, right? You see it, and people understand this as hierarchical. And that's particularly interesting to me because the way you have phrased it for us is not just touch, but touch as the ur sense. That's our prompt, right? We're supposed to talk about touch as the ur sense. And there's something quite interesting about the way you phrased it. The prefix ur in German, so it's Ursinn, Gefühl, has an ambivalence. Ur is both what is primitive, so the primitive sense, and what is proper, what is primordial. And normally when you have a term that contains an ambiguity, the tendency, at least for the philosophers, is to try to clarify which sense we are using and turn the ambiguous term into a non-ambiguous term, make it univocal rather than plurivocal. But I think that with respect to the question of touch, we need to maintain the ambiguity because at the core of the issue, as I see it, we are dealing with a sense that is both understood by the very same, at least philosophical tradition, as primitive and primordial.
I'd love to build on that because I agree so much about maintaining the ambiguity of touch. And we were told not to prepare, but nonetheless, on the subway, I was thinking about how it might be useful to think about touch as at once a common sense. There's no one who doesn't experience being touched. Everyone is differently embodied. Some of us are more sensitive than others, but we might even think about touch as a sixth sense to the extent that it's a common sense in a way that vision might not be. One might lose their sense of smell or never have had it. So I was thinking about touch as common sense on the one hand, and I think you mentioned something like, why is touch so mysterious? And to me, that felt like an invitation to think about how it's not only a common sense with both its pejorative dimension and its democratic capacity, but also an uncommon one. So we can imagine the sensation of being touched without a present material cause. We can imagine action at a distance where touch actually becomes something quite spooky. And I know some of you in disciplines where you imagine conjuring touch for limbs that are absent might have more to say about that in a scientific direction. But so I wonder if we might think about touch's dimension, not just as the first sense as the prompt has it, but also opening up maybe onto being a two-for-one, a first sense and also a sixth.
I can build up on this actually. So in my line of work, so I work in the area of robotics to help people with mobility disabilities to do different tasks. So let's say feeding or dressing. So let's consider the term like the work of dressing, like how when I got up in the morning and I dressed, I can dress myself, I can put this button in this hole, I can dress myself without looking, using proprioception and touch, right? And so in line of these kinds of fundamental activities, I truly think touch is fundamental. Without touch, it's very difficult to do these activities. There is, in fact, like around 20 years back, there was this experiment by Roland Johansson, where he basically anesthetized basically the fingers and asked people to do a very simple task like light up a matchstick. And they had full visual sense, and it was taking them a long time to even pick up a matchstick and then light it, right? So touch is fundamental. But it's also mysterious because the social aspects of touch, as you're saying, like let's say if a robot were to touch something, how do you perceive that? That's like a whole another, goes much deeper.
I think also people don't, so I'm just jump real quick, I think people are surprised by how disabled they are also. How much it's a part of their consciousness to not have their fingertips working properly.
Yeah, and I just love to add to that. So I like this idea that it's both sensed and, or the first sense and the last one, the sixth one, because like vestibular system, or sorry, proprioception is completely unconscious, right? We don't know that we're using it until it's gone, but that is a fundamental part of how we experience touch and how we go through our lives. But what I wanted to say was, when I think about why it's so hard to, or why touch has been so mysterious for so long is we touch with every part of our body, both internally and externally. And so while we see with our eyes and taste with our tongue and smell through our nose and hear through our ears, we're also touching with those areas as well. And so we touch in every part of our skin, and all of our internal milieu experiences touch. And we use it in a lot of ways that you would never think about. And so I think that makes it especially hard to understand how we touch and all the intricacies of it.
Right, and I also think that, there are three components that I think of when I'm, considering a sense of touch. It's not just that feeling on the surface of your skin, right? But there's also this proprioception, knowledge of where your body is in space. And then also there has to be movement, right? All of those three things are involved in, giving us a sense of touch, very different from other senses, right? Where there's usually just one perceptual capacity. But going back to your idea of the hierarchy, it being historically considered a low base common sense. Also, there's this argument that in humans, it could be that touch is the most developed, right? It's our unique sensitivity that makes us such a, I guess, cognitively advanced species,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see this ambivalence in Aristotle particularly.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, the sense of touch is, so if you look at, for instance, at the ethical text, not the De Anima, but the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is going to say that he's going to present a hierarchy of the senses and insist that the senses such as sight and hearing are higher, morally speaking, because you cannot have an excess of sensation, an excess of pleasure. However, okay, hold on. I should back up a little bit. The problem is that sensation is not just access to the world, cognitive access to the world. The point is that sensation is also connected to pleasure. This is why it shows up, the question of senses reappears in the ethical text. And the problem for Aristotle is to say, well, the sense of sight, the sense of hearing, there is no possibility of excess. However, taste and touch, that lead to excess and a possibility of living a lower form of life. You live the life of excess, of sensory pleasures, and as a sign of deprivation, you're depraved. On the other hand, the same thinker is going to tell you that there is a connection between the sense of touch, which is highly developed, most developed, as he says, in human beings, and intelligence, surprisingly. That sounds contradictory. And this is why I was talking about the dual sense of Ur, in the prefix Ur in German. The reason why he thinks that there is a connection is the following. We are extremely sensitive to the sense of touch compared to many other animals who have thick fur or carapace or shells or things like this that protects them, which makes us extremely vulnerable, right? It doesn't take a big blow to actually knock you down, contrary to other animals who would probably deal with it more easily. And this is because not of our extreme sensitivity, but our fragility, that we have to develop practical intelligence, phronesis, the intelligence of, like Ulysses, for instance, is phronimos, cunning, I think is the translation, because precisely as a human being is more fragile than many other species.
I wonder if you might share something about considering these issues. How much does that influence what you're trying to do in terms of engineering of this?
Sure. So basically, I think of this as to be able to, like robots, you can think of like they have it's like there's an embodiment, right? And with this embodiment, we are trying to do different tasks. So let's say even this simple task of picking up this bottle, like opening this and then drinking, right? And all of these things. Now, this involves manipulation of these objects. And so the idea, the way we think of using touch is basically how to be able to do these tasks, I need to get a sense of the environment around me. And to do that, to perceive that, there are different ways we can use touch, at least from the engineering sense. So we divide this into active and passive touch. So let me give you an example. So let's say I close my eyes and I'm touching this. Now it's a very local sense. Like in vision, I immediately look at entire thing, right? Local sense, I do this. But now if I actively combine this with proprioception, I can feel the shape. If I press this, I can feel that it's deformable, right? And then when I pick it up, based on the weight, I can adapt continuously. I'm adapting the force that I'm applying so that it does not slip off, right? So there is this very interesting question of active touch and also passive touch where it's let's say I'm just speaking of the weight or something like that, right? So we try to think of, in an engineering sense, how can we give this sense of touch to robots that we can do both active and passive touch so that the robots can get a sense of their surroundings. And once they have a sense of their surroundings, they can actually do tasks to help the humans. I can go deep into the engineering side of things if you're interested, but yeah.
That is that common touch, a sense a little bit, isn't it? In a way, you're saying you're trying to build up something so that robots can not only manipulate things with touch, we're calling it touch, but they have a sense of what they're doing.
Exactly. So basically getting the meaning out of the sensory signals, which is perception of the sensory signals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that is exemplary about the sense of touch is precisely this reversal between activity and passivity. When I touch an object, I am immediately touched by it. My activity is also a receptivity at the same time. It's the activity of a receptivity. And this is quite important, I think, because one of the characteristics, I think, of touch, to go back to what you were saying, actually, you mentioned indeed the fact that all the other senses are centralized in the face: sight, hearing, taste, smell. But we touch with our whole body. our whole body is sensitive. And so the sense of touch is really the sense of embodiment, primordially. And it is the condition of possibility of distinguishing inner, outer, inside, outside, distinction on which all the other senses depend.
Right. And so I have talked to some people who have been involved in experiments with prosthetic limbs, people who are trying to regain certain abilities with prostheses in labs. And so, of course, they're helped out by devices that help them pick up a water bottle, right? But what they describe isn't just, this is good for practical use. They say that when they have their prosthetic limb enabled with touch, they again feel like themselves again, right?
Yeah.
It's about that feeling of embodiment, personalization. So it's much deeper, right, than just gaining an ability.
This thread also makes me want to think about the individual versus the collective dimensions of touch. So on the one hand, the strong sense of personal identity, the person who's touching and being touched. On the other, an entry into a social field. And here, I want to think a little bit about the generative etymology of touching, which if we trace it all the way back up, gives us cognates like contact, contagion, as well as a range of meanings that include the sense of simply being affected. And of course, we might also want to think about how touch plays out not just within hierarchies of philosophy, but social hierarchies, who's touchable and why. Of course, this is the right room to say that Freud tells us that the taboo on touching is among the very first. So I wonder if we might also think about the collective dimensions.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, when you think about people who can be touched versus people who cannot be touched. Of course, when we're children, we receive more touch than at any other point in our lives, if we're raised properly. That's the case. But then after that, who gets to be touched is defined by society, right? Like men typically don't receive as much touch as women. Except in the context of sports. We create all these false reasons not to touch, creating this also craving that people have for social connectedness. And it's really just socially imposed, right? There's no real reason why we should be doing that.
Yeah, and not to mention people who are turned off, like, are hurt by touch, or like are very hypersensitive to touch, and don't like to be like where it becomes painful or obstructive.
And I think Pascal's comment lets us name violence, too. One of the vulnerabilities is the form of touch called violence. It's not just tenderness or eros. It's also like our mortality on the line.
It's a kind of intimacy, whether or not it's a violent intimacy or an affectionate one, right? And it's amazing how much this all gets built out, all of it, right, from this one what we're thinking is a fundamental sense. It's really. Now, I like this topic of the sort of excess that Pascal mentioned, that people become overindulgent with touch and taste, let's say more than the other senses. And the other, I guess, pole to that is the idea of pain, which I know is another interesting sort of form of excess in touch. I wonder if you I think, have a lot to say about that topic.
Well, actually, I have a quick question for you, which I don't know. I've always wondered, is pain part of touch, right? That's
They're part of the same system, and they interact with each other a lot in the neural processing, but generally carried by different types of neurons. But there's a lot of central interactions where one inhibits the other. Usually touch inhibits pain. They become part of each other. But yeah, I mean, there are people who, there are a lot of ways that you experience joy out of pain as well. Like when you eat spicy foods, it's like a joyful type of pain, right? Or if you're like scratching an itch and things like that. And so that's like ways that pain becomes pleasurable, I guess. And there's the thought is that there's the reasons behind that is that you have all these endorphin rushes and pleasures that happen in your brain from the pain being released or occurring.
There are individuals who don't have the pain fibers that I think transmit many types of pain. Not all, but I wonder about just excess of any sensation tends to be described as painful. And do those fit together? I mean,
There was a great essay by Jacques Derrida about
Touching,
what
very
called mimique, and he also writes a lot on touch. But in this piece about this piece called mimique, he describes tickling, and like there's a scene in a piece by Mallarmé where someone comes very close to being like tickled to death, and so like the path from pleasure into pain is in its most like astonishing in that moment.
part of our fragility also, another version of it being fragile.
Right. Well, I think also in addition to being able to experience these bodily sensations like taste and touch in excess, there's also this feeling about them that they're so connected to the body, and that, you know, humans, where what's superior is our minds, and like, you know, being able to see or hear, we can do that as a distance. So those are superior forms of sensing for that reason, which is unfortunate because this embodied sense of ourselves that we get through touch has such a deep form of meaning. You can't possibly like rationalize without also being able to experience those bodily sensations associated with touch. So it's just part of this mind-body dichotomy in general that we receive through society, right? This belief that we have to kind of separate from our bodies or, you know, elevate, just exist in our minds.
And why might that be? I mean, why might there be this wish to separate ourselves from our bodies, which is separating ourselves from the sense of touch? I mean, anyone have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure I have a great answer to that question, but I have a couple thoughts. The first makes me think, I think that Pascal's comment about the excess that's already baked into the problem of touch. Like we might choose not to pay attention to the way that we're being touched by the chair, by a gust of air, and so on, but it's there in an abundance if we turn our attention to it. And I'm also just thinking about, you used the word belief. Is this me? Is this my microphone that's whispering as well? This will be for the hearing panel. But at any rate, this made me want to think, the question of belief made me want to think about how we conjure and think about the problem of touch in language. And that made me think about a religious tradition where language becomes touchable, where word becomes flesh as a matter of course. And of course, if you've seen the artworks that depict this, or if you know this tradition, you probably know of the story where on his way to the resurrection, Christ turns to Mary Magdalene, who's about to like touch his garment, and says, "Noli me tangere, do not touch me." And so I think there's something about that sort of like primal like prohibition that on the one hand is everyday. Most of us have said it. Children probably say it as soon as they have access to language, but that's also linked up with the divine, with someone who has, who opens up onto an idea of especially efficacious language that can become like sensible to say, "Do not touch me."
Because touch is protective.
Yes.
There's a protective dimension to the sense of touch. Even in a social way, when they say they're untouchable, the untouchables are people who are pushed away for some reason in order to protect us from.
Yeah, or they're the sacred. Like I think it occupies both poles, like the divine that can't be touched, maybe can't even be beheld or seen, and then the most abject and taboo on the other.
So historically, I will say that the way that we, or at least in Christianity, the way that it's practiced has changed significantly over time in sensory ways. So there's this historian, Constance Classen, who's just looked at things like, you know, in the Middle Ages, how did people pray, right? They would kneel on the floor and they would, you know, to move their bodies, or they would sometimes hold relics in their mouths. And over time, the way we pray has changed to be mostly in our minds, right? Privately, having some kind of, personal relationship with the divine that other people cannot see. Just it exists in the mind's eye. But to go back to the question of why is it that we separate the mind and body in this way? I think that's just the way that we have been taught to value scientific thinking, right? Mm-hmm. That we should eliminate human intuition, right? And consider only what is objective. And that in a large part means silencing what we can sense through our own bodies.
There is this, in my field, like in human-robot interaction, physical human-robot interaction, there are these studies that were done, which is on the perception of touch, like social, affective touch, basically, right? And so, and basically there was a paper that was, what it was doing is was just wiping a person's arm. Like imagine it's a subtask of bed bathing, right? And users were asked, how do you feel to be touched by a robot? And the same thing that you brought up, what ultimately came out, the insight that came out is that intention is also very important. So if the robot was saying, I'm touching you to wipe off your arm, that's perceived differently, it's connected to language and intention and everything, and it's saying, I'm touching you to comfort you. And how people perceived, accepted the robot to do that particular task, changed based on what they understood about the intention of the touch itself. And it's a very layer deep, not just the act of touch.
On the flip side of that, like how you touch also gives your intention. Like if you go like this,
yes,
without saying anything, someone's going to know that you're trying to wipe something off. Whereas you're like going with a soft stroke, then you know that they're trying to comfort you or love you. So, and similarly, like if you're tapping like this, you're trying to get attention.
Absolutely.
If you're going like this, you might be comforting.
Yes, and
right?
warmth. Like, touch is not just about forces, right? So it has been found in effective touch that, and we have seen this in robots. Like if I make the artificial skin on a robot a little bit warm, people start feeling, it's more effective comfort than others. So it's very interesting.
Can you say more about the intention of the other person? And the reason why I ask is thinking of the mind-body link. Yes. It seems to me that there's something really interesting in the moment where a body, even if artificial, touches, and I want to know what's going on in the other person's mind. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically, what happened, so in the idea was that if it's also connected to trust in a robot, especially because it was a robot. I'm not sure if these results will translate to a human versus human touch. But when a robot was touching the person, what they found was that it is definitely relevant on what kind of active, like the touch that you were doing, whether you were stroking and things like that. But it's also a function of like how comfortable you feel. Not only the area of the touch itself, but also whether I know why you were touching me. And sometimes the action itself clarifies that, okay, you are about to do this task. But this intention becomes clear sometimes when the robot tells, okay, I'm going to touch you to do this. And then the person assumes that, okay, this robot is, what we understood, basically they understood the robot is purely a functional thing, is going to help me do this task, that's great. The moment they said that they're going to comfort, then lots of other aspects came into, like what does comfort mean? Is it just a function of touch that they're doing? Is it how they're stroking and all of those things? And that's when even the embodiment came. Do I want to be touched by a robot to feel comfortable? Or do I want to be touched by a human? So that became too deep. And so they said, I would rather be touched by a human than a robot. So that's basically the thing. Functional part was different than that.
It's interesting because the skin is innervated by different types of neurons that sense different types of forces and frequencies of stroking. And so there are neurons that are kind of tuned to those more effective ranges of stroking. And those are kind of helped convey that sense of pleasure.
We're
so they can be overridden.
Taking it apart, we're sort of deconstructing the very idea of what touch is. You see, it's got a lot of different qualities and aspects.
I think we tend to think of it on first blush as being, it's one thing, it's touch. Everyone knows what touch is, right? But it's hot and cold, it's soft, it involves intention. And I think we're hearing a lot of the comments here about sort of the awareness of the person who's being touched. And I'm really interested in how much touch then is somehow it's unified, even though there are all these different, let's say, fibers that are, transmitting the information and ideas that are attached to the information. What about that? It's like touch somehow being having a unifying quality.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I want to go back to something that you mentioned when you were talking about the common sense, sensus communis. So there is this idea in the philosophical tradition that all our senses are connected, and that there is a common sense, the koineaistesis, sensus communis, which unifies the data. And the common sense has three characteristics. The first one is that it perceives things that can be perceived by different senses. For instance, plurality, multiplicity or singularity can be touched. If I put 3 grains of sand in your hand, you can, or some, maybe not sand, that's a bad example, but marbles, okay? You can touch it and say, oh, they're 3. You can see 3, etc. But another characteristic of the common sense is that the common sense, most importantly, is that by virtue of which I do not just sense what I sense, but I sense that I sense. There is a reflexivity that is built in. Later on, the Stoics are even going to talk about the common sense as an inner touch, touching from within. That is shared by all the senses. So all the different senses are like specification of this fundamental common sense, which is associated typically with the sense of touch, and that unifies all the senses. And if you think about it like this, one of the characteristics of the other senses is that they are specialized. Sight is primarily about colors, hearing is about sounds, etc., etc. But the data you get from touching are going to give you a wealth of information: rough, smooth, hot, cold, wet, dry, the shape, the form, etc. It gives you more data than the other senses, a wealth of information.
So Sushma, you mentioned earlier the use of prostheses and how when they work effectively, the person who's relying on them actually feels it becomes part of them, right? It's all incorporated into their self-consciousness, I guess, or their consciousness. So is that because it's a human being? Or is that something that we think that eventually robots might achieve?
I think we're pretty far from robots achieving a human-like sense of touch. Actually, when you think about the way that our sense of touch works, it is so sophisticated, right? We think of it as this base sense, but how difficult is it to program a robot to feel in a pocket for the keys, pull them out, right? It's enormously complicated, and we can figure out how to do that within our first year of life, right? It's pretty amazing. So I don't know about robots having a human-like sense of touch, but even when the very primitive sense of touch that we're able to give them, if we were able to work with them in factories, if they were safer to work with in factories, I do think that there's this divide, right, between the human and the robot that would start to fade. If we saw them not just as like tools, but more like our coworkers, right, which is what I think giving them the sense of touch would enable.
And I will follow up on this. Actually, the way currently in state of the art, like we are giving robots the sense of touch is very different from how it works on the human. I'll give you a very high level thing. I mean, of course, you are the expert on how this works, but like, in human touch, right, you have all these different corpuscles, like Meissner corpuscles, Merkel cells, like they have all of Pacinian corpuscles. Each of them have different roles. some sense, light touch, some, like deep pressure, some sense skin stretch, some things like that. In robots, the way we are giving this sense of touch to robots, basically I would broadly, is very different from this. Like broadly, I would categorize this into 4 different types. So let's say one kind of sensing is resistive sensing. What does that mean? Basically, let's say I have this sweater that I'm wearing, like it's a sleeve. Now, if this becomes a resistive cloth, and it is sandwiched between 2 conductive chalk, it's basically a resistor. When I touch, it pushes, right? Like it gets compressed. And that resistance is mapped to force using a calibration function. And now what we do is, just like in our monitor, we have pixels, we call them taxels, tactile pixels. So it's made of a bunch of taxels, and we distribute them according to, this just noticeable difference. Like basically how sensitive spatial resolution-wise a particular area is in a human body or in a robot that we want versus how less. Like, this goes back to the idea of the homunculus, which is, our lips, our fingertips are much more sensitive spatially compared to our back of elbow. Like if you touch very nearby, you won't feel that they're different touch. So we distribute them in that way. Similarly, we have capacitive, similar to how your phone works. We have piezoelectric magnetic. So the way we are doing this touch is basically from what we want to do, from the application standpoint. We want to sense force. We want to sense warmth or something. How do we do this technologically? It's very different from how we do this in like how a human works. So it's very different. But the end goal is that, yeah.
I was just going to say that you kind of beat me to it, but that it's enormous, like touch is enormously complicated. Like it feels, it's something that we take for granted because it's so easy to do, but just how the neurons and cells in the skin encode touch is just, in these, from the peripheral sense, they all encode all these different features that you wouldn't think about of the magnitude of the force, the vibration frequency, the different, the duration of touch, the movement, all these different things, and that comes together in the central nervous system to kind of bring out these other properties, and they coalesce together to make the symphony of touch, I guess I would say. And so it's that's why I think why it's made it so difficult to make robots that can mimic human touch, because it's so much more complicated to get all those things together in one system. Yeah. That our body does naturally.
Close.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear this humans robots thread, because our prompt opens with us inviting us to think about how it's a capacity that we share with animals. So I'm especially curious if the scientists in the group have thoughts about animal touch on the one hand, and I think this thread also did a really good job of letting us ask the question, where is touch?
Yeah.
Like you let us think about how it's localized or its privileged locations. And of course, there's a famous philosophical tradition that wants us to think about how we think with our hands. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this thread.
Well, I think, it varies by animals. Some animals have used touch very little, but things like animals like rodents, like they have their face is enormously represented, and they use their whiskers and all the hairs on the body to feel touch. And they can feel just like the slightest movements on their hairs. And the same with, I think, dogs and cats. You'll notice that if you just touch them very lightly on their skin or on their hairs, they can feel that. And so it varies enormously between species.
I don't know if you've seen that animal, the star-nosed mole,
Yeah.
which has that star, but it uses that organ because it's looking for food underground. So it uses this extremely sensitive organ to feel where it can find food, So the variety of ways of touching in animals is pretty amazing. And also like using electromagnetic sensing as well, right? I guess you could consider that part of an animal sense of touch, which we do not have.
Dogs also, at least, seem to be interested in what our attentions are when we touch them. And I think you may have all tried to reach out to a dog to pat it and the dog may go like this, and then you try to reassure it that, this was meant to be a caress, right?
Have you heard of this robot called Paro? So it's actually a therapeutic tool. The only thing it does, it cannot do any of these things that I was telling you. The only thing is it looks like what is the animal? Like, it's a dog, like some pet. And only thing it does is you just do different kinds of, strokes, different kinds of effective things, and it reacts in different ways. There is no intelligence, it's pre-programmed. But apparently it is in many elder care homes and things like that. And it's really making them reduce stress. Apparently, there are studies apparently. I haven't seen that, but I haven't read the papers, but it reduces stress and things like that. And just to your point, roboticists are trying to always get these kinds of inspirations, even though there is a huge gap in what we can do in technology-wise and what is there in biologically. We have robots with whiskers. We have robots with hair to feel motion and things like that, to sense all of those things. But the whisker is basically just like an antenna that touches and then you feel. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I would also argue as humans that we're not just, that our hands aren't the only primary place we feel touch, it's also the mouth.
Yeah.
And so the mouth is
Yeah.
enormously overrepresented in humans.
What's come to mind for me is this sort of dichotomy between looking at things in a sort of reductionistic, materialistic way, where we try to divide touch into its several or multiple components, and how we may then construct touch artificially. And then on the other hand, this gigantic gap that we're describing, including the unification of our consciousness. And I also encourage people to think about this idea of there's something poetic about that. There's something non-materialistic and more interpretive about the way touch works. So I wonder if people want to take that topic up.
Well, there's this huge connection between the language that we use for touch and emotion. And, some people have suspected that, the form of our language comes from these bodily feelings, stress, for instance. What is stress besides maybe general shakiness of the body, which we first learn maybe when our mothers were holding us and, they were on the phone waiting for someone to pick up for too long, right? Those feelings, those emotions that we have are first experienced as touch sensations, right?
I'm also just thinking about your comment, which I think lets us think about the mouth as the place where we touch language. And I'm wondering if the group would be open to a little snippet of a snail poem that I brought with me. Okay, thank you. So I just thought that this will let us think. This isn't the full thing. This is from a poem by the French poet Francis Ponge, whose dates are 1899 to 1988. And it's a prose poem, but I just thought this group would like it. And this is the snail speaking. At the same time, I am glued to the earth, always touching it, always progressing, though slowly, and always capable of pulling loose from the soil into myself. Après moi le déluge, I don't care. The slightest kick may roll me anywhere. I can always get up again onto my single foot and reglue myself to the dirt where fate has planted me. And that's my pantry, the earth, the most common of foods. Joy to the snail, but they leave their proud slime on everything they touch. A silvery trail follows them, and maybe this points the way for the beaks of birds that love to eat them. There's the rub. To be or not to be, that is the question. Such vanity, but that's the danger they face. And I love these snails. I know it's a little wacky, but I love these snails, but I also love that when they touch, they leave us slime. And this makes me think of our own saliva and the trace and the trail that we leave in language when we talk and we write about something like touch.
And that certainly goes beyond the sort of scientific way of thinking about what is touch. And doesn't that bring something more to the conversation, though, right? I mean, it's not, is that bridgeable? Is science capable of dealing with that? Is the Enlightenment capable of dealing with these thoughts or ideas?
Talking about what you were mentioning earlier as the question of the limits of reductionism, there is in the old tradition, we say pre-modern tradition, the treatise on the soul, there's hundreds of treatises on the soul that were written for centuries. There is the idea, often repeated, that there is a difference between nutrition, the nutritive soul, which is shared by plants, and the sensitive soul, which is shared by animals and humans, of course. And the difference is that nutrition in plants occurs without desire. It is only contact of the roots with the nutrients in the soil that does it. But the plants, although it feeds itself, doesn't desire to be fed. It's just purely mechanical. When it comes to touch, however, then we have the sensitive soul, the sentient soul of your animals. And here, instead of just contact, you have touching. That is to say, there is an experience that expresses a desire for food, the most basic form of desire that they can think of. It was the desire for food. And this is not explainable by purely mechanical processes. So this pre-modern tradition, in many ways, is in fundamental disagreement with modernity. By modernity, I mean, I'm thinking about Descartes, the mechanization of the body. As you know, what happened in the 17th century is that the mechanistic approach to biology rejected the idea that there was a soul that could animate the living being, and that all was explainable in terms of mechanics. So reductionism of biology to chemistry, chemistry to physics, and the lower level explains the upper level. But for the pre-modern, on the contrary, there is a threshold between the plant that has contact but does not touch, and the animal that can touch and experiences its activity.
I would say that plants can touch. A little off topic, but yeah. So there are some recent papers on the mechanoreceptors in plants, and that they use them for guiding the breathing. Yeah.
Well, but that, it goes to also the related topic of motion and movement, right? Which we brought up before, as also another aspect of touch, right? Because plants are a little bit less mobile, certainly, than animals, and that may also relate to our ability to have animals' ability to have desire, isn't it? Isn't that?
Right. Well, I think that the difference here is what plants do have the sense of touch. And I don't know. This is actually the way that it works. But I think that there's this belief that animals, they have self-aware touch. I think that's the difference.
In German, the word for touch, I think, is something like berühren, and the root of that means to stir. And I think that that's a nice way of thinking about being moved. And of course, like when we say that we're touched, we're talking about being moved. Right. So I think there's a nice sort of linkage between the metaphoric and social senses and then the sensory ones that we're talking about.
Yeah. How much is manipulation part of touch, right? That's another.
There's a seminal paper by Lederman Klatsky in 80s where basically they said they cannot, it's very connected because exploration is an inherent way of you use touch to perceive the world. Exploration plus touch, which is active touch, which we were talking about before, right? So motion is very important. Yeah.
We've probably all seen these references to octopuses and how they appear to be sentient in some important way. And of course, if I don't know about all the rest of you, but if they have a lot of ways to touch, right? Yeah. With all their arms, there's so much touching and the suctions and such. And isn't it interesting that they're felt to be more aware than other similar beasts? Yeah.
They need writing so that they can pass down that information,
They're also covered with, their tentacles are also covered with chemosensors, so they're like tasting or smelling at the same time that they're touching.
Right.
It's interesting to imagine what role that plays in their ability to synthesize their experience and create a sense of the world, right? That's a little bit more rich than, let's say, plants. Yep. So what do you think about this, the idea that, what you all think about this idea that there's something, there is something sort of that poetry gets at in terms of touch, that, let's say, inner touch, which many poets, I think, they may describe it differently, but there's a sense they're trying to engage your inner touch with poetry. I mean, does that seem coherent with what we've been talking about here?
I mean, I think it depends on the poet. But I do think that one of the things that your question opens up for us is thinking about how language, how art more generally tries to make experiences that are ineffable or mundane, for that matter, sayable and feelable. Like, you've probably had the experience of watching a movie or getting a surprising phone call. You are far away from the screen, or just, no one has landlines anymore, but maybe some of us still do. But at any rate, the proximity is not that it touches you, but you feel a physical effect. And I think there is something about the poetic, among other faculties, that lets us imagine touch as not relying upon the most intimate of proximities, but maybe happening at great distances. Sometimes we feel the most touched, metaphorically speaking, from a text message from someone far away. And the only thing we're touching is the phone. And yet there is a sense of an inner quality nonetheless. And that's where I think that the spooky sense that I brought up in the beginning, the sixth sense, comes a little bit more into view in its ordinary capacity with the work of art and the inner feeling of exaltation or surprise, boredom that might arise in reading something on the one hand, and then the world of superstitions or just slightly paranormal experiences where the person who's touched, or in the lineage of like the evil eye, there's a tradition of healing too that calls upon touch as a capacity. So I think it's very porous, even though at times it might seem far away from the world of octopi tentacles and measured experience.
Well, as you were saying earlier, to see is understood to mean I understand, right? I see means I understand. To touch means, like, if I'm touched, I feel, right? It's a different part of the mind that is evoked through the sense of touch. And just so much of language is trying to give words to things that we understand purely physically at first, right? So reaching for the skies, that's something that we do with our bodies, but it is meant to also associate with something that our minds do when they're reaching. And so I think that's kind of how poetry gets us to connect with these feelings that we have in our bodies that are also translated into emotions, right? So all of it, is connected.
I have a question actually. So, is there a connection between, because different cultures perceive touch in different ways?
Yeah.
Has it somehow affected how the language, evolved in these different cultures about language for touch?
That's a very good question.
In English and in French, you say I was touched by something. So emotionally, you see something. So I saw that sad scene and you was touching. I was very much touched by it. It's not true in every language. Like in Armenian, you don't say I was touched by it. And I don't know.
Is there a connection with in the culture itself, like how?
So I think there is a cultural and language difference in terms of how you describe the effect of touch.
Interesting.
Certainly there are cultural differences in how you're taught to use touch, right? Like, one of the first things you learn about politeness when you're very young is don't touch, just look, right? But also just how you're supposed to touch people around you. All of that is highly dependent on culture.
That makes me want to just use another related word for touch, which is tact, which names this problem, the one of politeness that's culturally and historically contingent on the one hand, and then the tactile on the other. I don't think that our fates are in etymologies, but I do think it's important to think about, as your comment about different Christian practices brought up, like how our experiences of touch and the languages we use for them are both historically and culturally contingent. I've been working on this it's become a lot bigger, but I became interested in clapping as a thing that hasn't been theorized. So I had a funny experience where I gave a very boring committee report and my colleagues applauded. So naturally I asked my therapist, so I talked about this and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do some research and I'm gonna find a psychoanalytic theory of clapping, but there is none. And a lot of people have stuff to say about touch. And children learn how to clap roughly before or during the phase of development known as the mirror phase, but no one, maybe someone in this room will tell me later, no one wants to talk about clapping, which is fine. It's banal, it's an ordinary achievement. Our hands do a lot of things. But clapping, the thing that children do is nearly universal, independent of culture. Applause is not, and that I think opens up an interesting set of questions to your cultural and linguistic conundrum. And in ancient Greece, the god Krotos invents clapping. There's an ancient Egyptian goddess named Hathor who's both a goddess of clapping and of fertility. I think that there's still a lot more to be researched about touch and its faculties, but also a lot more to be said, even though everyone in this room can say something about touch.
Just to back up to to your point before, I think about hearing touch or having language evoke touch. I think this gets into how not just touch as part of as one sense, but as somatosensation as a whole, that we have all these internal senses of that are referred to as interoception of pain and all these other feelings inside of your gut, and that your language can really evoke those different types of emotions that are felt in your gut and then I guess touched in your gut or that are released in your gut. As a sense, and then taken in emotionally.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely, and it makes me think about the snail leaves this silver trail, and so your comments make me want to think about how we have to communicate in a language of the body in order to communicate our sense of terror or whatever. Our snail leaves a silvery trail. It's beautiful, it glitters, the language invokes argent or money as well as silver. So I think I agree with that and think that that's very suggestive.
I'd like to go back. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I saw your bio before our roundtable today and saw the thing about clapping. And I saw, I started noticing my 9-month-old clapping intuitively. Listening to music and being so excited about it that she's clapping. And I was like, I wonder if that's just something that babies do. And then we encourage them, right, by clapping with them.
Yes.
Right? That was my theory of clapping.
I will tell you that animals only do it in captivity. So I'm like, what is the human? Not just the laughing animal, but the clapping one.
I think, isn't there a role, in other words, some of the clapping, like you said about your colleagues, that's like a formality.
Yes.
They show.
Yeah.
But there are other times where it's a way of expressing the intensity of the emotion. It's a way of discharging that emotion, like I think you're describing, that the music does something and you have.
Yeah, I think it's a way of being rhythmically present, having a sort of synchronized experience. And I think also it might be a way of managing aggression. When we're clapping, we're not beating someone up. And maybe when I tell my colleagues to like send in their report by a certain date, give my injunction, the applause is both a socially licit way of giving me feedback and subterranean style, another message
That was a
altogether.
really boring talk you said you gave, right?
Yeah, it was.
So can I just ask if when animals clap in captivity, are they just trying to get attention, or what are
They learn it. So there is, and here I'm going to step out of my disciplinary lane to say there is a swamp gorilla that does a single clap. So there are animals that are capable, but the kind of clapping that your 9-month-old does, animals only, like great apes, only do in captivity when someone has taught them in a sort of imitative way.
I'd like to go back to the question we mentioned in passing a bit earlier, which is a connection between the senses and the aesthetic dimension, the arts. When it comes to the form of arts, we seem to have a relatively clear distinction between visual arts, certainly, in painting, obviously, music for hearing. And when it comes to taste, you could think maybe if we consider cooking as a form of art, why not? They could count. As far as smell is concerned, you could consider maybe perfumes, making perfumes as a sort of form of art, maybe a lesser art, but it doesn't matter. When it comes to touch, however, I don't have an immediate art form that I can think of that I would associate with it. However, I have heard of some contemporary sculptors who actually do invite the people who go to the exhibit to actually touch their work. Some sculptures I think would be horrified by letting the public touch their work, but some sculptures say no, you have to touch it. If you want to understand it, you must touch it. You must put it in your hand. You must feel it. You must stroke it. That may be the only case I can think of in which I would see a connection, not an obvious one, right? Don't try to do this at the local museum. You're going to be in trouble. But I can see a possible connection between the sense of touch and an artistic expression.
I think in paintings especially, the texture of the paint can often evoke those feelings in you too. And so you're not supposed to physically touch the paintings, but you can sense what they would feel like or think about what they'd feel like when you see these very textured paintings.
And that's the language for it too. The painter touches up the painting.
Yeah.
There are also fiber arts, right, that are focused on touch, right? But that's, I think, considered like folk art, right? We don't take it as seriously as a visual art.
I mean, well, first of all, I have to bookmark something that you said, Pascal, for future roundtables, because Tapo had asked whether there's some connection between touch and touchability and culture. And of course, your accent and your reference to food and perfume made me think, oh, there is a culture, there's a cultural connection there, right, for sure, in both instances, but those are different senses. I don't like to leave this feeling that I think is often expressed that there is this gulf between, let's say, the humanities and science, or between Romanticism and the Enlightenment, with regard to connecting a materialistic way of looking at things with a more poetic way. I really think it's a challenge to all of us to try to understand this and keep going, because it's such a rich topic. I guess what I'm thinking about with poetics is that it's that common sense that I think we feel poetry might touch, right, or touch in us. And I have to feel that with enough time, these other efforts to understand touch and to create touch might eventually get us to that sort of, I don't know whether people think that's impossible, or I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
I think like our colleagues in quantum, I think would be able to square the circle for us, because I think that, and maybe you know more about this than I do, but when I think about entanglement or the old problem of action at a distance recast in explaining the world that we live in through a science that no longer relies on mechanism, like I think that like there's nothing more poetic than the spooky universe that quantum gives us. So, and I think I felt very moved by your description of like the mouth as the mouth with the hand as primary loci of touch. And I think, you know, the hand is what writes and what holds and what cradles, and the tongue and the mouth are like where we say like words of affection, where we vocalize poetry. So it is they are different disciplines, but I don't experience it as a rift exactly.
I think just throughout time, artists have kind of picked up on things that scientists haven't in a lot of different fields, and so I think we have a lot to learn from each other to try and explain why we find things really beautiful or really moving.
But I think it's, you know, not a huge leap from understanding how to give robots the sense of touch to questioning, you know, the role of touch in our understanding of humanity, right? That those are not.
And this is very connected, because even though, let's say, first we focus on the functional aspects of doing things, ultimately the role of robots is to be in human society and help humans do different things. And that is impossible without understanding that other part, right? So it's always those social aspects of touch and other aspects of touch and how people perceive touch, not just mechanistically, but also like it's very, very important to technology acceptance.
One topic we've not touched on, which I think relates to what we're all talking about just now, is the idea that touch, this, I guess, is evoked when you think about babies putting things in their mouth. And it's sort of a way of distinguishing their own body from the outside world. There's this idea both of presence and of identity that I think is a strong component of what touch provides.
I don't know the underlying principles behind my baby, but I have seen my baby do this all the time, putting things in their mouth to perceive the world. So that's definitely something that they rely on a lot.
But also stimulating the outside of our bodies also helps us to gain a deeper understanding of ourselves. And this can be seen in research on patients who have anorexia, who become very disembodied, right, as a result of their illness. They lose connections to their interoception, right? So their hunger cues, they become less aware of them, and they see themselves more and more just but as an object. And when they are massaged gently, right? They're very precise about the way that they're touched in these studies. You know, with this certain amount of pressure at this certain amount of speed, right? It has to be a loving touch, and when they are stimulated in that way, it helps them to regain their sense of hunger, their sense of their internal bodily cues. So
again, isn't this also connected to the development in general? Because I know, again, I'm not an expert in this, but I was that touching at early stages of development is also connected with autism spectrum disorder and everything, like how you process touch, hypersensitivity versus hyposensitivity and things like that. So, like, because, even though it may go to the, like the sensory cortex, but it's connected to the motor cortex and all other things and how they exchange information. So, yeah, it's very interesting, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of beautiful work on that specifically, that if at least the animal models of autism spectrum disorder, that you have these deficits in touch sensation, either hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, and that correcting those can correct some of the behavioral.
Because I noticed in the daycare, my son now goes to daycare, they have this thing called sensory table. And this sensory table, every kid just goes and then touches different things. I think this is a part of that, right? So just touching different, from grains to bigger things to deformable things, and developing the senses, which is...
I've had the experience and the pleasure of treating some patients with autism on the spectrum, and I've found, again, I'm not an expert on this dichotomy, but I've observed it, that I think the more common sense about people on the spectrum is they don't like to be touched. And I guess we think, well, they have a deficient endorphin response or something else goes wrong. That's sort of a easy way to describe it. But there are some other patients who are autistic who like to be touched a lot. And they love to hug and touch all the time. And it's really interesting how those two different poles exist in that group.
I believe it was Temple Grandin who invented a squeeze box, so she could be, touched in the way that she wanted, in a way she could control, so it was predictable.
And I guess we could just add on to this another story in the development of our relationships to touch also has to do with self-touch and how we understand our bodies. And so here I'm thinking both about like the taboo around all those like taboos around self-touch, and then the self-touch we do all the time in public and clapping, but
like this,
along the vertical axis. But like the experience of children discovering their own bodies, of the awakening into sexuality and how that is embodied and elicited by touch, I think is also a part of this story. And
When we touch ourselves, we're an object and a perceiver at the same time, right? Because if you touch your feet, for example, you feel your foot in your hand and you feel your hand on your foot. And it does create, I have to imagine, some sort of boundary that is represented in the brain in some way. Well, I wonder, this was really fascinating. There's so many different aspects. I wonder if we can open up maybe the floor for some questions from the audience. If anyone has, please, yes, please do. Yeah, it's for the audio pickup.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
for the.
So I'm just curious, you didn't make a distinction between touching and feeling. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, like I feel the fabric versus touching it. Thanks.
Well, there is a reason I called my book on touch How to Feel, because it does have those two meanings at once. And there's also this really interesting form of synesthesia called touch emotion synesthesia, where if you, like I talked to one of the first people who was found to have that form of synesthesia. And she described, like, she puts on a silk dress and she forgets everything else. She just feels the pleasure of that dress. She can, anything bad that happened that day, it's gone, right? So there's such a strong connection between those two. And I think for all of us, like, there's this theory of, where does synesthesia come from? And it could be that we all have these relationships to our senses that as we get older, those connections get pruned, right? And we just maintain the ones that are most useful to us. And so we do understand something like having a rough day, right, as being connected to a texture of roughness, right, of like having something working against you, and also that emotional feeling, right? So there are ways that we all do that. But for some people, that connection is much deeper, right? So I think that there is a very strong connection between touching and feeling.
And I'll quickly add on to this. There was this, at least from the robotics standpoint, there was this work that was done maybe 10 years back or so called haptic adjectives. So the idea was they basically had many people come and touch different kinds of textures, softness, hardness, and then they asked people to describe what they felt, like using some adjective. And then they wanted to connect the physical feel, like physical touching, like the sense to the words they used to describe it. And they found like around 54 different objectives or something like that. But again, I don't know how exhaustive that study was, but people are thinking about it even from the robotics standpoint.
There's also a great book called Touching Feeling by Eve Sedgwick that some people in the room might know. And the place where one of the places that she locates the collision of those two concepts is in affect, like the embodied experience of emotion. But I like your provocation that we think about how we might separate these concepts, even as touching seems to blur so much.
Yeah, hi. In the realm of polite society and people touching other people, so much of the conversation is in taboos, like when not to do it, why you wouldn't. Very, very complicated, obviously. And I'm just wondering has any thought been given or research done on the need to be touched, again, in the context of society? You could even, can your skin even, can you measure the need to be touched? I don't know, but it just seems that so much of the discussion is about when not to, when in fact, there are perfectly good reasons and safe reasons and appropriate reasons why someone would just yearn to be touched. So if you could comment on that.
This particular thing actually came up a lot during COVID. So there's a lot of work that has started. Basically what happened was during COVID, when people are not allowed to meet each other face to face, they were just discussing via Zoom or something else, people started feeling anxiety and things like that. And there's some work where they were like, okay, touch is necessary. You need to feel touch. And there were some researchers who developed embodiments where you could touch, basically you can communicate touch remotely. Basically you are touching something here, and then you can feel, and if you touch another object there, you can feel, because this will mimic how this is changing. And that seemed, again, this is not a huge sample size, but that's why people actually felt like they are more connected. So this has gotten a lot of traction after COVID, especially, I would say, at least in robotics.
I'll add to that.
Sorry.
I'll just add to that too. There is a classical example from history of I think Soviet orphanages, Russian or Ukrainian orphanages. Is that what you're going to?
No, I was going to say something different.
But that there were children that were left without being reared basically without being touched at all. Romanian, okay. And that they ended up having these terrible through their life course had incredible mental health issues throughout the rest of their lives from being deprived that from an early age.
So there are very serious consequences to not having touch early in our lives, right? We just have this huge need for socialization, and touch when we're really young is assurance that someone else is there to protect us, right? Which is when we don't have any other abilities to take care of ourselves, it's vitally important. But there's actually been a lot of research in the past 10 years on skin hunger in adults. So for a variety of reasons, people are receiving less touch. Fewer people getting married, more people living alone, and a lot of different types of taboos around who we can touch. And so that's associated with lots of psychological issues, anxiety, depression, and so there's not really a solution for it, but it is a growing issue for sure.
I think one of you had commented as we are more and more taken over by texting as a form of communication. The thought that you actually are holding this in your hand, reading someone's text, is very powerful.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah. I think about all the online apps that try to there's at my institution there's a job search site called Handshake. It does feel like there's this compensatory effort, and I do think that contact is not exclusively tactile, but I'm still quite taken with your the thing you said about guessing intention, and that made me want to think about how the infant navigates the experience of being touched and learning how to exist in the world and to be embodied and to imagine eventually what's in the mind of someone else as they enter into language. And I think your question lets us think about the afterlife of that, potentially in the absence of desired touch, but also in the field of desire.
Thank you.
I think there is, if I may go back to the point that you are mentioning, and obviously you know more about this thing than me. This is outside of my area. But I know that in the development of virtual reality, there is a possibility of extending the realm of sensation quite significantly. So far, virtual reality is essentially audiovisual, primarily audiovisual. You have a mask like this and you hear sounds and so on. But I've been told that there are developments, so I think it's a glove to start with. Yeah. I don't think you can buy it yet. It's probably in research and development. It's probably cost a fortune, which allows you in virtual reality to touch, say, the doorknob, and you feel the pressure of turning the knob. And the idea is that the next stage would be like a full body, like a wetsuit, if you want, as scuba divers use. That would allow you to feel the sense of touch throughout your body.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. In VR, there's a lot of development in haptics, getting haptics in VR.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm just a medium for the questions coming from the internet. So I just have one from a purple icon person. They don't have a username, so thank you, purple icon, if you're still watching. It's Prince. It's Prince. Prince touched me, wants to give this message. So they were asking about touch developing in infants. Aside from social implications, I asked, could you please flesh out that question? They said infants seem to need to be totally touched for security. So I guess talking about touch and security or any other reasons, infants seem like, develop touch in that way, so.
Well, there are those famous Harlow rhesus monkeys that were exposed or not exposed to a soft hairy cow, and how differently they develop based on that upbringing.
Yeah, and in gestation, touch is the first sense to really develop, and you think about them in the womb, as I do a lot right now. They get a little bit of light, and they get a little bit of sound, and they get a little bit of taste, but what they're feeling all the time is like your body next to them, and that feeling your heartbeat and feeling like the warmth of their mother and everything else, and they respond to touch in the womb, and so I think that. Personally, I think that's probably a big part of it. They're cast out into this world where everything feels different on their skin, and so they need to have that, the warmth and the.
I think it also sells a lot of linens. It sells a lot of linens.
Yeah.
So the comfort of the bed and the womb. Well, sure, please.
First of all, I'm touched by this presentation. I know a young lady who spent the first 11 months of her life alone in a crib as an orphan, and no one really interacted with her, and she's struggled. And I also know now a granddaughter who we all hold, and she's coming along very, very well already. She's not even 1 week old and she can write. No, I'm kidding. But she's done very, very well. And I'm wondering, do we do enough talking about this, talking to mothers and fathers about how effective this is and how to, because I don't understand touch and I'm really fascinated by this. I guess there are 800 million things in my finger alone, and my mind processes all that. But do we do enough really talking to families and educating them on how important this is? That's just my question.
I don't think we do. We don't train parents in that, but part of it is intuitive, right? Just this, and also just the natural way we feed our babies, right, is holding them close.
The psychoanalytic views of childhood development, touch is very important. And the mother touching the child, other touching the child, and the deprivation from touch are considered important psychological, either positive or negative. But
Well, I think that sort of wraps up a really fascinating conversation. I was touched also. And I don't know, are there any other puns or jokes we can make about that? I'll think of something. You
I
got one?
hope we stay in touch.
Very good. Hold on.
I think we need to like all clap for ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention. Okay, take care.
Sorry, I had to. Thank you so much.